Good morning or afternoon or evening, everyone, depending where are you watching us from. And thanks for being here again. This is Anna from Climate Tracker, and I have a very special guest with me today, Julianne Riches. Hi, Julianne, how are you?
Hello, I'm excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, technical problem. So we are here today to talk about loss and damage. But first of all, I wanted to introduce Julianne so you see who we're speaking with. So Julianne has been working on climate change and has a lot of expertise for many years, especially on loss and damage, climate justice issues. She developed the Carbon Levy Project for the Climate Justice Program, which aims to force the fossil fuel industry to pay for climate damage. She also was part of Climate Action Network as an international policy coordinator and lead a very interesting campaign that forced the G7 countries to phase out coal with a very famous report that you maybe have seen that's called Let Them Eat Coal for Oxfam Great Britain. But aside from that, I'm sure you've heard about her because she has written about financing loss and damage. She has written as well about migration and displacement, about climate litigation. So that's why we wanted to have her here today, just to be able to understand what happened with loss and damage at COP, and also what is loss and damage in general. So for those of you who may be new to this, we are doing this webinar for several reasons. One, because we were concerned, shocked, and interested on the outcome of loss and damage at this last COP, which just ended. I don't look tired, but I was really tired after this last COP. But also because we are launching a new campaign that you can all check in our app. It's a campaign for people from Asia specifically, which aims to raise awareness about loss and damage. And the most exciting thing here is that the winner gets to go to the bond negotiations, which will happen in May with the Climate Tracker team. I will be there. I guess Julianne will be there. Please check it. You only have to go to our app, app.climatetracker.org. I will make sure to put it later in the description. And please write articles about loss and damage. I'm sure after this interview with Julianne, you will have tons of ideas of what to write about. So thanks for being here, Julianne. And my first question is, what is loss and damage? Why is it that important, and why are you interested in it?
Yeah, well, it is super important. So thanks for having me, and thanks for focusing on loss and damage in this project. The reason it's important is because loss and damage is the worst impacts of climate change on the most vulnerable people. So because we haven't done enough mitigation, we haven't reduced our emissions enough, and there isn't enough finance for adaptation, what we're left with is impacts that you can't adapt to anymore. We're left with loss and damage. And so some examples are, for instance, extreme droughts and land increasingly turning to desertification, which, you know, we can see now in the Horn of Africa. We've had 3 years, or the people in the Horn of Africa have had 3 years of extreme drought after drought after drought. Many of them have lost all of their cattle and their ability to grow food. And so we're kind of approaching, you know, or living loss and damage in that area of the world. So these extreme droughts and desertification lead to basically people not being able to grow food anymore like they have in the past. So they lose their livelihood and their ability to farm. And it might lead to what's called non-economic loss as well. So it might lead to the loss of their cultural identity as farmers and may force people to migrate. So that's kind of one example. Another example is the supercharged storms. Obviously, in the lead up to this year's COP, in September, October this year, we saw extreme hurricane after hurricane after hurricane, records broken in the Atlantic, even kind of hurricanes approaching the UK, which is extremely unusual. So, and we also saw extreme monsoonal flooding. So the monsoonal flood was kind of much worse than it would typically be, and much and different to how it would typically be. So much more compressed, much more extreme rainfall and more extreme flooding. And these things destroy houses, destroy infrastructure, destroy crops, and displace people, force people to have to move from their homes. And then I guess the final example is the one that often springs to people's minds when they think about climate change, which is sea level rise. So, and that was really relevant at the COP we were just at, with Fiji as the presidency, where we see particularly the Pacific Islanders, but also countries like Bangladesh, where seas are rising and stealing people's land and forcing them to relocate where they can relocate, or, you know, some of them to migrate across borders as well. So all those are examples of what loss and damage is, and the loss and damage that people are already living now.
Thanks, Julian. And I guess people now have a better understanding of where it is. If you have questions while you watch us, and I forgot to mention this, you have, next to the screen you're seeing us, there's a side chat of a YouTube chat that you can send questions through. But I'm also checking Twitter, so if you want to tweet at us, I'm also, at the end of this conversation with Julian, ask the questions that you have. But you mentioned COP, Julian, and we know that loss and damage has been there for a while. What is this history, and what happened in the climate negotiations in general with loss and damage?
Yeah. So loss and damage has been around for a while, you're right. Really, it's been around since 1991, since the beginning of the climate negotiations. But for a long time, the climate negotiations focused on mitigation, reducing emissions. Then when it became clear we weren't doing enough of that, some of the focus shifted to adaptation. And now it's clear that we're not doing enough of either of those things. So loss and damage has become known as the third pillar. And it was agreed in the Paris Agreement as the third pillar of climate change. So maybe I've gotten ahead of myself. So we did discuss it for a long time, but it took a long time for it to come to the fore. And there was a really big breakthrough in 2013 when we established the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. And that was set up with kind of three mandates, three things that it was supposed to do: to understand loss and damage better, to share information of people working on it and affected by loss and damage, and also to what's called enhance action and support, so provide finance for loss and damage. And then we established that, and then the Warsaw International Mechanism started working kind of with an executive committee that manages it. We trundled on a few years. We had the Paris Agreement, where, as I said, loss and damage was established as the third pillar alongside mitigation and adaptation. And so now we're 2 years after the Paris Agreement and thinking about how to implement the Paris Agreement. But all along this road, and even still today, rich countries have done everything they can to try and stop us talking about loss and damage, to try and stop progress on loss and damage. Essentially, the reason they want to stop progress on loss and damage is because they don't want to live up to their responsibility to pay for it. So they've caused this problem. You know, the climate change that we're feeling now was a result of the historical emissions of rich countries. They don't want to have to pay for the costs that are currently being faced by the poorest people in the most vulnerable countries. So they do everything they can to try and stop talking about loss and damage. But regardless of that, we have still made progress. At the most recent COP, we didn't make enough progress. What we were really looking for from the most recent COP was a clear plan forward on how we were going to deal with loss and damage finance. How are we going to ensure that the people on the front line of climate change get the money they need to deal with the worst impacts? And we did not get what we wanted out of the last COP, for sure, and loss and damage was one of the most disappointing outcomes of the last COP, but we still got something. So what we got was, I think what we got concretely out of the negotiations was an expert dialogue, and it's called the Suba Expert Dialogue. And so it's a one-off meeting / dialogue that will be held in the middle of next year in Bonn. And that will have feed input into a technical paper that the UNFCCC are putting together. Now, that doesn't sound like a huge outcome, and it's not a huge outcome. It should not be characterized in any way as a win. It was not a win. It was like the absolute bare minimum you could possibly do and get by. But on the other hand, we did get some kind of bigger, more meta wins on loss and damage at this last COP. So, for instance, we came into it partly due to that terrible hurricane season, the terrible monsoonal floods, the terrible droughts that I talked about earlier, partly due to all those impacts that we can now see playing out. We came into the COP with a real focus on loss and damage and what we were going to get on loss and damage. So it was very high on everyone's agenda. It was high on all the political leaders' speeches. So if you look back at the speeches that the political leaders made at the COP, at the high-level segment, many of them, particularly the vulnerable countries, talked about the need for loss and damage finance and talked about how the Warsaw International Mechanism, the WIM, wasn't really operational yet. So we kind of got a very high-level political push for more on loss and damage finance. And that's a big thing. I don't think it's happened in such a concerted way before. And as I said, media focus on it as well. So now I feel like, one of the things that is so exciting about you guys taking on this project is that in the past, I don't think the media has understood loss and damage. But I think what is now clear out in the lead up to and coming out of this COP is that people now understand what loss and damage is better. There's more coverage of it. There's more focus on it politically and in the media. And so now we need to translate that into progress next year, like progress going forward. So we need to make sure this expert dialogue is good, make sure that this high-level political emphasis remains strong, and that we actually do make some concrete steps to providing finance funds for people on the front line of the worst impacts of climate change. So finance for loss and damage. Sorry, I went a bit all over the place.
No, that's awesome. And actually, I was just checking, and some people at the beginning of the talk were saying, but what is loss and damage? So I see that for sure it's necessary for us to explain from the beginning, what is it, how is it working, which mechanisms it has. So thanks for the summary of how it would look like as well after this COP. Like, okay, let's meet in May and see what they do of this expert dialogue. So we will really be looking forward to that. But let's speak about finance, because as you mentioned, it's one of the most difficult, sticky points of this issue. What kind of solutions have been spoken about? Do you have ideas, or do people talk about ideas, even countries?
Yes, well, you're completely right. Finance is the sticky issue. It's the real reason that loss and damage has so much trouble progressing. And, the real reason that it's so sticky is because rich countries don't want to meet their obligations and pay for loss and damage, which they absolutely have an obligation to pay because they're cause. So rich countries are responsible for the majority of the historical pollution that's caused climate change. So they have a responsibility for that. It's also worth noting, well, hang on, let's come back to that. But yes, so finance is the difficult bit. But if rich countries were to stop kind of fighting every step of the way when it comes to loss and damage and actually listened to what people were talking about and behaved a bit rationally about it, they would be less afraid of loss and damage finance, because there are essentially the people who have worked on it, myself and many others, have kind of looked at loss and damage finance within the context of overall climate finance and within even a broader context of development finance as well. So it's really, oh, wow, it just started snowing in London. Anyway, that doesn't happen very often. Anyway, if you look at the broader context, there's not enough finance for development and there's not enough finance for climate. And most of the climate finance is just rebadged aid. So they've moved ODA aid into another pot and called it climate finance, but they haven't actually generated any new money, which really they have an obligation to do and they agreed to do. So what people working on loss and damage have done is go, okay, well, we need to just stop rebadging money, the same money, and calling it many different things, and we need to come up with new money that's genuinely new. And so there's a range of proposals around to do that. And one of them is one I work on, which is called the climate damages tax. So essentially what the climate damages tax does is to say the fossil fuel industry are responsible for roughly 70% of the emissions in the atmosphere. So 70% of emissions come from fossil fuels. And the fossil fuel industry, so the oil, coal and gas companies who extract fossil fuels from the ground, sell it for profit, some of them huge profit, so trillions of dollars of profit a year, and essentially outsource all the cost, the true cost of their product onto poor people who are facing the impacts of climate change. They should have to pay a tax every time they extract coal, oil or gas that can go towards a loss and damage fund. So there's that proposal, a climate damages tax. There's other proposals like airline levies when you fly internationally or nationally, but probably internationally. You will pay an airline levy that will go into a loss and damage fund. There's other proposals like to tax international maritime and aviation fuels, which are currently untaxed. There's also a financial transaction tax known as the Robin Hood tax, a proposal to apply a small tax on some financial transactions, high volume financial transactions that don't add much value to society, and put that money into an international loss and damage fund. So there's all these options that could raise easily $200 to $300 billion a year that could go into a loss and damage fund. They're all new. Many of them are polluter pays, so they're actually the industry causing the problem, paying for the damage that it's causing. And they would all mean that rich countries would not have to go back to treasuries and seek money from treasury. So I guess that's why I'm saying rich countries don't need to be as scared as they are. But we need to make sure, I mean, rich countries do have an obligation to pay for loss and damage. So if this money is not enough, then they need to bottom line it. They will need to make sure that they contribute to loss and damage. So it's in their interest to set these schemes up well and effectively. And importantly, it's super important to make sure that each of these schemes is fair. So and what I mean by that is we want the fossil fuel industry to pay for its damage. That's only fair. But we don't want, in setting up that scheme, it to impact on the economies of poor countries or the living costs of poor people. And there's ways to build in equity or fairness into the ways you design these things. Within the UNFCCC, that's called designing something within the CBDRRC, but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities principle, the equity principles of the UNFCCC. So you can design each of these schemes to ensure that it meets those principles. And I guess that's what we think should be implemented as loss and damage finance.
Very interesting, Julian, and we are receiving a lot of questions that will come after my last one, so that's getting exciting. I have just one more question for you, which is what needs to happen during the next month or in next COP to improve policy on loss and damage? You mentioned the momentum, but maybe you want to talk a bit more about this.
Well, the momentum is probably the most important thing. So this project is really exciting. We need projects like this. We need people who are watching this and thinking about writing about loss and damage. To do so, we need to keep talking about it and keep it high on the political agenda. So big thanks to you and to the people watching. Super important, most important thing. Then the more geeky and maybe concrete end, there's submissions that are due in February on loss and damage finance. We need to make sure all the countries who spoke up in the plenary who spoke up at the high-level segment about how important loss and damage finance is. We need to make sure all of those countries put in a submission so that to keep that momentum going, so that their concerns are captured within the incredibly slow-moving and geeky UNFCCC process. And then we need to make sure that in that mid-year meeting, you know, we're covering it really well. People know that it's on, that we will need to apply pressure to make sure the right people are on that panel, that the outcomes that come out of that meeting kind of put us on the right path to go forward. So I'd say they're the concrete steps, but talking about it, writing about it, raising the profile, keeping to raise the profile of it is probably the most important thing we can do.
Great. So I guess our viewers are trying to do that. So that's awesome.
Yes.
So I'm jumping to questions, unless you want to say something briefly.
Totally.
Yeah. So I have Alana from the Philippines who says two questions go kind of together. She says, in terms of finance, what should it address? Because rich countries have argued that there is already an adaptation fund to take care of loss and damage. And then she says, there's also a growing trend of offering insurances from the private sector. What can you say about that?
Two excellent questions. Thank you. So there's already an adaptation fund. We don't need to worry about a loss and damage fund. I guess the main thing, the clearest thing is that there's not enough money. There's not enough money for adaptation already. And so we know, because we haven't done enough mitigation, we need to do more mitigation. We need to keep climate change as low as we possibly can. But we've already cooked in loss and damage, even if we keep climate change to 1.5 degrees. And we're on a 3-degree pathway. So at a 3-degree pathway, we've cooked in huge amounts of loss and damage. And the more adaptation we do, so the more adaptation is funded, the less loss and damage there's going to be. And so we need to fund adaptation as much as we possibly can, at least as much as has been promised. Like the promises, which, you know, rich countries are already trying to wiggle out of, and are insufficient for the amount of adaptation that we need to do. So we do not want to dilute that money. And if we just take the adaptation money that's been promised and move it over to loss and damage, then that's a lose-lose situation. It's a lose-lose-lose situation, because not only will you not do enough adaptation, loss and damage is way more expensive than adaptation. If you can do adaptation, it's the same in disaster risk reduction. If you can prepare yourself ahead of a disaster, then the cost of the disaster will be so much lower. And then the spillover effects of, you know, loss and damage occurring, needing to try and provide finance to support for that, and then the spillover social effects will be dramatic as well. So it doesn't work for anyone to just spread an already small amount of adaptation finance even further. It's a lose-lose-lose situation. And then there is actually the small consideration that rich countries have promised to provide loss and damage finance. They promised to provide it in 2013 when they set up the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. They promised to provide it in the Paris Agreement. They reiterated that promise in the year after Paris at Marrakesh. The last COP that's just gone, they said, yes, loss and damage finance, terribly important. So they keep promising to provide it, and they need to live up to their promises at this point. So not only do we need it, but they've said they'll provide it, so they need to stop trying to renegotiate everything every time we meet and actually just live up to their promises. So then on the second question about insurance, excellent question. You're right, there's a massive overemphasis on insurance. So it's part of part of the rich countries' playbook. So they promised to provide insurance. They promised to provide finance for loss and damage in the Warsaw International Mechanism. Very clear promise. They've said it about 5 times in there. But somehow, all we ever talk about, rather than finance for loss and damage, which is an obligation of rich countries, all we ever talk about is insurance. And the underlying assumption behind insurance is that poor countries and poor people will pay for it. Now, so in this playbook of not talking about finance and rather talking about insurance, rich countries are trying to shift the responsibility back onto the people on the front line of climate change who did nothing to cause this problem. So it's extremely unethical, this shift from finance to insurance. Now, all of that is not to say that insurance doesn't and won't play a role. Insurance does play a role. It is helpful in some circumstances, but those circumstances are quite limited. So insurance is most relevant for extreme events that don't occur very often. So storms, droughts that don't occur very often. And there are examples of insurance initiatives around the world that do that. The Africa Risk Capacity, the Caribbean, the CRIF, Caribbean Climate Risk Insurance Facility, and the PCRAFI, Pacific Island Climate Risk Insurance Facility, maybe. Anyway, the ARC, the CRIF, and the PCRAFI are examples of insurance. But insurance is never going to cover slow onset events. So it's never going to cover rising sea levels. It's never going to cover when land turns into a desert, desertification. And then it also becomes not useful when storms become so frequent and so intense that you can predict there's always going to be a storm every year. So why would you pay an insurance premium? So the premiums will basically become so high that they'll be useless. So in that instance, insurance is also not useful. So insurance has a role, but it's a constrained role. And we need to start talking about actually financing loss and damage and stop only talking about insurance.
Great, awesome response, Julian. Thank you. And I'm sure Alana has a good response to her questions. I have two more for now. The first one is from Arthur from Belgium. He wants to know more about this Suba Dialogue thing. So he wants to know if we know more details, what could be positive outcomes and what may be lacking so far of this dialogue.
Yeah, that's a super good question. I do not have a very comprehensive answer to that. In the COP decision, there is a paragraph that refers to it, it doesn't have much more than its name. So I hope that it will be high level, as in it will involve ministers. But I don't know that that's clear in the COP decision. And I certainly hope that it will involve, that it will go for a significant length of time, not just be like a 2-hour meeting held off to the side somewhere, and that it will be a key focus of when we have the intersessional, the mid-year meeting in Bonn, that it will be the key focus. And as all my previous answers will make clear, I think it's super important that it not focus on insurance, that it not just be about insurance, that it be about how we actually provide finance for loss and damage, including for slow onset events, like sea level rise and desertification. So I think that the February submissions will help define what the dialogue looks like. So that's part of the reason the February submissions are so important. So we need to make sure all of our countries get submissions in. And also not only just our countries, but NGOs can write submissions too. So if you're a registered observer in the UNFCCC, you should be writing a submission on loss and damage for February. So it's a good question, but I don't know the answer to that yet. But encourage you to ask it to more people.
No, great. And we will for sure try to follow up what comes out of these submissions in February, because my understanding is that they will define a bit how this will look like. So very good. I have one last question. I have Joanna asking here a slight different question here. She says, can any of the lawsuits that seem to be growing around the world taking governments to account for lower ambition in their climate targets, can they use existing loss and damage as evidence or reasons for support? What do you think?
Yeah, I think again another really good question, and it's great. The questions are pulling out all the things that I should have said and didn't say earlier. So you're right to note that climate change litigation lawsuits are happening all around the world now, and part of that, well, I think that's a reaction to the fact that governments have not acted to meet the scale of the problem. So they haven't taken enough mitigation. So there were people taking their governments to court saying you haven't done enough to reduce your emissions. And there are also court cases on for both adaptation and loss and damage costs. So, one that immediately springs to mind is Saul Luciana from Peru. I think he's from Peru. Yes, Peru. Who is suing RWE, a big German polluter. And he's suing RWE saying, well, you helped to cause climate change. RWE is responsible for something like 1.3% of emissions, historical global emissions. So therefore they should pay 1.3% of the costs that Saul's village and town is facing in the face of climate change. And in their case, it's melting glaciers that are leading to glacial lakes being too full, and the risk of glacial lake bursting and overrunning the village and possibly killing and destroying the village below the glacial lake. So there's steps you can take to mitigate, to adapt, so to basically stem the glacial lake so it flows slowly rather than kind of bursting in one go. But they cost money, and Peru and Saul's village doesn't have this money. And RWE have made profit causing this problem that Saul's village now have to deal with. So that's going through the German court now. So they just made a significant win in that they're allowed to take it to the next step. So I think I've forgotten part of the question, but I don't know if I'm answering it. But I think yes. Oh, that's right. So yes. And then another example is in the Philippines. The Philippines Human Rights Commission is hearing is holding a hearing against the carbon majors, the big fossil fuel polluters, big fossil fuel industry companies, and how their business model is impacting on the human rights of Filipinos who are facing more extreme typhoons, amongst other impacts. So yes, the impacts that people are feeling now absolutely are being now seen in court cases and will increasingly be seen in court cases whilst governments refuse to take action. So, rich countries, if they had undertaken enough mitigation and provided enough finance for adaptation, we wouldn't be in the place we are, where we're facing loss and damage. And that's on rich countries for sure. And part of it is also driven by the fact that the fossil fuel industry knew they were causing climate change, went out of their way to lie and deceive about it. And so for that reason, they should face the costs of climate change as well, not only because they're causing it, but also because they did their best to lie and deceive and convince governments to do nothing so that they could make money, which is possibly the most unethical thing I've ever heard of. And they should have to pay rather than poor people having to pay.
Yeah, if the viewers need more information, we also did many campaigns on fossil fuel industry. We have tons of webinars and lots of material if you want to write about this or anything. But there's a lot of interesting organizations focusing on these issues. The campaign Exxon New is one of the biggest ones. But I don't have any more questions. I don't know if I finally have a last one or something. But Julian, do you want to say anything else, like as a final remark or something you maybe forgot to say before?
No, I think all those questions kind of really helped wrap up all the things that I should have said and forgot to say. So that was great. Thank you. And thank you to you for holding it. And I think, back to the point that loss and damage is super important. And it's great that it's now becoming more understood, but it's still seen as a bit niche. So it's super important that, you know, the people watching this write pieces, kind of explain what it is, explain that it really is, it's kind of the face of injustice for climate change. So it's, loss and damage is a living example of how unjust the system that has led to climate change is, and how it's kind of greedy industries and greedy governments wanting to make money, wanting to continue their own lifestyles at the expense of the poorest people in the most vulnerable countries who have done nothing to cause this problem. And we need to address that by being serious about loss and damage in the international negotiations. And there are solutions, like, you know, e.g. we talked about litigation. That's a solution. It's a piecemeal solution, but it's the one we have to use because we have it at the moment. And there are other solutions like the climate damages tax, you know, where the fossil fuel industry should pay for the damage that it's doing. So all of these solutions kind of can help drive us towards a fairer and a more equitable approach, where the poor people on the front line of climate change are not paying the real costs of our fossil fuel-based society.
Thanks, Julian. I think that sentence of loss and damage is the face of injustice can be like the title of our webinar. It's super great. And thanks again for being here. And of course, thanks everyone who is watching us. This is recorded, so if you want to watch it later on and just write down what Julian said to write your article or anything, please do so. And I will just finally thank you for being here again, and we will keep you updated for sure on how this campaign is going and the articles we have.
Right.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.